Welcome back to Behind the Universe Raw vs. SmackDown. Today we're going to be covering WWE 2K14, and if you're unfamiliar with how this goes, be sure to check out the last part where I talked about WWE 13 as well as what's going to be going on with this little project. So WWE 2K14 started off with the SummerSlam pay-per-view, and kicking off this show, we had the Tag Team Championship match between Zack Ryder and Jack Swagger taking on Tons of Funk. The tradition of Jack Swagger opening each pay-per-view continues here, but they would end up losing the tag team titles to Tons of Funk in a matchup that was, Tons of Funk, I would have to say, was one of the, if you ignore the atrocity that was the whole Air Boom situation with the tag titles, I'd have to say that Tons of Funk, their title reign, well then again, their title reign was about as memorable as Swagger and Ryder's reign, because they won them at Vengeance and immediately lost them here. The tag title picture, it took a while to actually get this division finally up and running in a decent capacity. That wouldn't actually begin to take shape until a couple of months down the road. But here, Tons of Funk had defeated Primetime Players to become the #1 contenders, so they got this match and they won. It's another instance of there isn't really a storyline here, it's just kind of the champions need a contender, so here's a match. That matchup was representing Monday Night Raw, by the way. Then we had a singles match, non-titled, no real stakes involved with this one. It was just a straight-up singles match between CM Punk and John Cena. This was, again, a matchup representing Monday Night Raw. And as for the storyline going into this one, I had this weird thing where Vince McMahon was involved, and this was supposed to kind of play off of the previous tag team matchup that Punk and Bryan had against The Shield, except Bryan would obviously compete later on against The Shield, CM Punk going in a different direction, but Vince, his concern was like merchandise, like CM Punk wasn't selling enough merch as opposed to John Cena, and that's why Punk didn't deserve an opportunity. Again, like, it's not good. It's not a good storyline. Maybe there's potential there if I had done it differently, but the way it was used here, it just kind of seems like it's one of those immersion-breaking things, like we're just breaking the fourth wall, and it wasn't any good, but it was a storyline nonetheless, so I will give that credit. It also doesn't help that Punk and Cena had squared off already, like, heading into this pay-per-view. I think they had a match on Main Event, and then they had another match at the pay-per-view. The Punk-Cena rivalry, it was kind of like an off-and-on thing for a while in this series, and this was the first real time that they clashed on a pay-per-view. And I guess the match was okay for my standard at the time, but it wasn't that memorable of a match. It would ultimately be John Cena who came out on top, but nothing really stemmed from it. Then SmackDown had their first match of the night. It was for the Intercontinental Championship, Christian taking on Ryback. This matchup didn't have much of a storyline build-up going into it. However, there was a bit of a connection to the match at Vengeance because Ryback ended up going through Curtis Axel, the previous challenger, to get this opportunity against Christian. And it was, of course, Ryback who defeated Christian here. This was the match that kickstarted his massive Intercontinental title reign that would go all the way up to WrestleMania. And at least even up until now, it is one of the longest title reigns in Universe Mode history, tied with the Wyatt family for the current record, although by the looks of it, Kevin Owens is coming up pretty close. It's possible that Owens could break that record here pretty soon. But back then, Ryback defeating Christian, who had a pretty good reign as the champion. I mean, he didn't really... His matches weren't much to write home about because there wasn't really any storyline with it. It was just kind of set up challengers so Christian could knock him down. But in terms of the length of his title reign, the only superstar who had a title reign on the same length as Christian's was Jack Swagger, because they both won their titles at Extreme Rules, and of course Jack Swagger would ultimately outlast Christian's reign. He would have what at the time was the longest championship reign in Universe Mode history, up until Ryback's title reign would eventually surpass that. But as for Christian, his title reign, it was good in terms of like the amount of days it was, but ultimately not a very memorable Intercontinental Championship reign. Then there was a United States Championship #1 contenders match between The Miz and Cesaro. This was my attempt at keeping the United States Championship somehow relevant to the match card, because Jack Swagger wasn't defending it, he was competing in the tag title match, so I didn't want to have Swagger competing twice on the same show. So I did this instead to kind of keep the US title relevant. Although, didn't really have much of a build-up going into it. It was just kind of two guys who I thought were the closest to being the next number one contender. So they faced off, and then things got weird. You had Bray Wyatt interfering in the match, distracting Cesaro, and that helped give The Miz the win. This matchup was ultimately pointless because, like, Miz won. He defeated Cesaro to become number one contender. Then he would have a match against Jack Swagger for the US title on main event, but he lost. It was, I guess I had wanted Cesaro to win this match at first, but then I think Bray Wyatt just kind of showed up in a cutscene. Or no, maybe that wasn't what happened. Honestly, it could have been that The Miz just won in the AI simulation, and I figured, well, Cesaro can't lose clean, so let's give him a storyline. And so I just kind of pulled Bray Wyatt from out of nowhere and just debuted him here. And I've talked about it and pretend it never happened, that my handling of the Bray Wyatt character early on was not good. Like, the 2K15 stuff was questionable already, but then this very first introduction was not good. It was worse than not good. It was awful. But at least it was a storyline, and this match had some semblance of future implications to it, even though they were ultimately meaningless because Miz just lost his shot at the title anyway. So it had implications, they just were very, very minor implications. For once, I can actually give a specific brand credit for a Divas Championship matchup. This one featured Natalya versus Kaitlyn, the first of what would ultimately be 3 matches between two singles matches, and then there was also a triple threat involved. But honestly, this is where the Divas division kind of starts to go downhill, because I would ultimately get stuck on this rivalry between Natalya and Kaitlyn for 3 solid months, and it was really uninspiring, this rivalry. It was just kind of, somebody has to face Natalya since Beth Phoenix is gone, so Kaitlyn ended up getting the shot, and then she lost, and I guess I wanted AJ Lee to kind of step up at the next pay-per-view, but I don't know, somehow Kaitlyn got thrown in there again. I think I might have actually wanted Kaitlyn to pick up the title, because I was originally looking to have Kaitlyn and AJ Lee kind of carry the division forward, but then ultimately Kaitlyn got released from WWE, so she was kind of stuck as my Divas champion, and I'll talk about that a bit more later on, but it just ultimately didn't work out. This feud, very bland, and this matchup just kind of started it. Natalya ends up retaining here, though Kaitlyn will get a rematch at Night of Champions. I can give SmackDown credit for this, but I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing with how this matchup played out. Then you had the World Heavyweight Championship 6-man Battle Royal, the matchup that was supposed to be a Championship Scramble match, but because the Championship Scramble stipulation wasn't in WWE 2K14, they had taken it out without my knowledge. I had to quickly retcon it into a 6-man Battle Royal, which I talked about in Pretend It Never Happened. So, it was Sheamus versus Wade Barrett, Randy Orton, Mark Henry, Alberto Del Rio, and Batista. It was ultimately Randy Orton who would win this Battle Royal. I believe it was the final 2, it came down to Orton and I don't remember exactly who the final 2 were, but Batista was eliminated pretty early on. Del Rio was taken out. Mark Henry was gone. It was either Randy Orton and Barrett or it was Randy and Sheamus. But it was good to finally get the belt off of Sheamus, you'd think. But at the next pay-per-view, Sheamus is just going to get his rematch and take it back. So really, the World Heavyweight Championship scene was garbage up until Mark Henry finally won the thing, and I actually started to kind of develop some sort of a plan with it. But as long as Sheamus was the champion, I wanted to get the belt off of Sheamus, and then whenever I would get it off of him, he would just win it back because simulation. So this matchup, not much to write home about. It was one of, I would have to say at the time, one of my favorites in terms of, like, you get these 6 superstars in the ring, and it was back when you could still do pinfall elimination battle royals, so there was a real sense of scale to this matchup. You're bringing in 6 top names, even though I hadn't really billed them that highly, because it was just a series of matchups that would, like a series of number 1 contenders matchups, really, because Wade Barrett defeated Batista when Batista first arrived, Randy Orton because he won that triple threat at Vengeance. I think that's what got him into this match. Mark Henry defeated Big Show and Batista. Alberto Del Rio defeated Edge, which led to this whole Edge injury storyline. I would have him say that, like, he broke his arm. Just because, like, I had all these superstars I was bringing back now that the UCW storyline was over, and I was trying to find a way to fit them all into the card, and Edge just was kind of the odd man out, so I just wrote him off with an injury to put Del Rio in this matchup and then just get rid of Edge so I could focus on some of these other guys. And then, of course, there's Batista, who just really floundered getting into this matchup. And then after this match, he just disappeared because I didn't book him well, and I didn't know what to do with him after he failed to win the world title, so I just wrote him off again. And finally, the main event of SummerSlam, Daniel Bryan and the Brothers of Destruction versus The Shield. This is another matchup that I've covered. Dean Ambrose did not defend the WWE title at SummerSlam, which, I mean, that's not good, but hey, The Shield's in the main event of another pay-per-view, so good on them. Well, I guess technically this was their first pay-per-view main event. Yeah, Dean Ambrose main evented Capital Punishment, but that was just him. This would kind of set the precedent for The Shield being involved in these big six-man tag team matchups, because before, for some reason, I tried to build up The Shield as individuals, as, like, I didn't really focus on them as much as being a unit. I tried to, like Dean Ambrose going for the WWE title, and then you had Reigns and Rollins who were just kind of there, but I was also putting them in singles matches more often than not. So it was around this time that I finally realized, like, hey, The Shield is a faction, maybe you should try to build them up as a faction. So we did that, and The Shield goes on to defeat Team Hell No and The Undertaker, and the match was okay, I guess. It sort of set the precedent for what would later on be... It kind of set the standard for what a pay-per-view matchup featuring The Shield would be like moving forward. Obviously, at Survivor Series, you get the big Team Icons matchup that I'll get to. And then at TLC, you had another matchup, another six-man tag featuring The Shield. So this was the first matchup that kind of brought them back together and started to work towards actually building The Shield as a unit. And I feel at this point was when I started to kind of understand The Shield and perhaps start to actually get some credibility behind them. As for which brand gets credit for this pay-per-view, it really is a toss-up because, again, this pay-per-view was okay. It was starting to kind of figure out how to set up storylines, but there's not a whole lot of lasting impact with these matches. Most of the title matches are just set up a challenger and knock them down, and that's assuming the titles were defended at all. The US title didn't make the card, the WWE title didn't make the card. I think I'm gonna have to still give credit to Raw for this one, just because, while neither show is really setting up a lot in the grand scheme of things, and neither brand really had the best booking going into it, I will at least say that the main event, the six-man tag featuring The Shield, at least kind of laid the groundwork for the potential rivalry that would basically take up the majority of the series between just starting to set things in motion with The Undertaker and The Shield. And then you also have John Cena defeating CM Punk, which would indirectly lead to his match with Dean Ambrose at Night of Champions. So in a way, that kind of was a number one contenders match. You also have at least the US title number one contenders match was trying to set up some storylines. I at least got the bad Cesaro versus Bray Wyatt feud out of that, which, yeah, it was a bad feud, but at least it was a feud. It was, in a way, a sense of foresight on my part, because I was trying to move towards future events. The tag title match was really underwhelming, but compared to SmackDown, which sets up this uninspired Divas title feud, you get the World Heavyweight title match, which was just kind of a mishmash of various challengers on the roster, Batista getting completely mishandled, Randy Orton's title victory ultimately meaning nothing. The only real saving grace for SmackDown was the Intercontinental title match, but again, that's just a standard title match. There was no real feud going into it, so there really isn't much to write home about with SmackDown. I'd have to give this one to Raw. And as for where this pay-per-view ranks compared to everything else, I'm gonna have to give SummerSlam the edge over Vengeance, as much as it really is a toss-up between the two shows, but ultimately, I think SummerSlam does just a little bit more to try to lay the groundwork for future events. And even if it doesn't do a great job at being an entertaining show in its own right, that's not exactly a detriment to its quality compared to what came before it, because I honestly wouldn't say that any of the WWE 13 pay-per-views were entertaining shows in their own right. You might have the occasional good moment here and there. But in terms of overall quality, I guess SummerSlam was starting to move things in the right direction, so I'm going to have to give SummerSlam the edge here. Then we move on to Night of Champions, which also feature the King of the Ring tournament. And in fact, I think I'm going to start with the King of the Ring tournament, just because it did play such a huge role in this pay-per-view. This pay-per-view brought back the pre-show element, but in this case, it at least made sense, because the King of the Ring tournament was huge, and unlike in 2K14 where I made it its own pay-per-view, here I also tried to fit it into Night of Champions, so it was a lot to try to cover in the amount of time I had allotted for Night of Champions. So what I ended up doing was just condensing most of the first round matchups. Not quite the second round matchups, but the very first round I just kind of condensed into highlights and threw it onto the pre-show, which I think was a good use of the pre-show. This was probably the pay-per-view that best used that pre-show element, because while, yeah, it did just kind of breeze through the first round matchups of the King of the Ring tournament and ultimately kind of undercut the meaning of it, it did at least, it was reasonable that I would have a pre-show, because it's a way to kind of trim the fat of this tournament, trim the fat of the whole show, and just throw it on the pre-show. And then I also threw the Intercontinental Championship rematch between Christian and Ryback there, which I do think, as far as pre-shows go, that was probably the best matchup I had put on a pre-show, that match between Christian and Ryback, because it was, in a way, its own main event, the way it ended up playing out, Ryback kicking out of 3 kill switches. So I think it worked having it on the pre-show, giving it its own spotlight, following after all of these first-round King of the Ring matchups. But just taking a look at the King of the Ring bracket here, I'm going to have to give the edge to Monday Night Raw, just because SmackDown has Triple H and Shawn Michaels, and there really was no reason to bring them in there other than I wanted to give SmackDown's bracket a bit more star power, but ultimately I feel as though that undercuts the whole point of the King of the Ring tournament, which was to give the spotlight to all these different superstars. I mean, just looking at Monday Night Raw, you have more relevant guys in there. You have, of course, the up-and-coming Bray Wyatt. You've got Seth Rollins, Cesaro. Yeah, The Miz is in there, Kane, Undertaker, Jericho, Kofi. But none of these guys are legends that I brought back just for this tournament. And I'm not saying that bringing back a legend for the King of the Ring was necessarily a bad decision, but I know why I did it. It was because SmackDown's roster just didn't have, I guess, the openings I was looking for. I mean, really, looking at the SmackDown bracket, it's all over the place. You have a debuting Fandango, you have Darren Young of the Primetime Players. These are not main eventers by any means, whereas if you look over at Monday Night Raw, Raw at least has Chris Jericho, Undertaker, Kane, Seth Rollins, Cesaro. Cesaro wasn't quite a main eventer by this time, but you have at least a good 4, maybe 5 guys over here on the Raw bracket who can at least be considered main event contenders. Looking over at SmackDown, you have Mark Henry, Del Rio, Wade Barrett. That's really it. They were all in the SummerSlam matchup. But then, you do have guys getting opportunities like Cody Rhodes, like Fandango, but then bringing in Triple H and Shawn Michaels. I know what I was doing. The whole point was really to put over Mark Henry because I did not want HBK or Shawn Michaels to have, HBK or Triple H rather, to have a long role, like a sustained position on the roster. I just wanted to bring them in as kind of special attractions, special guests for this King of the Ring tournament. But ultimately, I think that makes the King of the Ring less special. It ultimately detracts from it because Triple H and Shawn Michaels have no long-term investment in the series, and they had no real development prior to this tournament, so there was no reason to get hyped for these guys being in the tournament, because it wasn't like Cody Rhodes, who had been in the series from the beginning, who had been competing for like the Intercontinental Championship and had kind of failed to regain his spot on the roster. This was a chance for him to elevate himself, to try to move up the card. The same goes for guys like Wade Barrett, Del Rio, Mark Henry, guys who had shots at the world title and just failed to get it. This was their opportunity to earn another shot at that. You could consider The Undertaker in sort of a Legends role, but at the time, he was a full-fledged member of the roster, unlike Triple H and Shawn Michaels. So as far as the King of the Ring tournament goes, I have to give Raw the edge in the brackets just because there's more going on there. You have superstars getting opportunities who otherwise wouldn't. You've also got some main event names in there, which gives the tournament some credibility. You could understand these guys, if they would get a shot at a world title, you could see them winning it. Whereas SmackDown, would you really picture Darren Young winning the world title? Would you really picture Fandango winning the world title? And not to mention the forced inclusions of Triple H and Shawn Michaels, SmackDown just really falls flat in this tournament, which is kind of ironic because it would be a SmackDown superstar who wins the tournament, the whole tournament. And I do think it worked out in the end. Mark Henry, yeah, I had DX putting over Mark Henry, which was really the only way that their inclusion would have worked, was just to put over one of the current up-and-coming superstars. And I mean, Mark Henry's not exactly a spring chicken, but he was an active member of the roster, and I mean, really, he has been a mainstay for the majority of the series, so he was the right guy to end up putting over. Mark Henry would, of course, beat HBK, Triple H would beat Del Rio, so Henry would go over both of them. Wade Barrett would beat Cody Rhodes, and he ended up facing Fandango in the second round. The way that this bracket was structured is just strange. Like, why would Cody Rhodes... I mean, I guess I figured that Fandango, I might have tried to actually give him a push in the series at this point. So I put him up against Darren Young, thinking that, yeah, if he did win, then that's a believable win, and he's moving up in the bracket, so that's a chance to get the spotlight on Fandango. But realistically, it would have made more sense to put Cody Rhodes in a position like that. Have Barrett versus Rhodes in the second round rather than the first. I mean, it's not like I specifically planned the outcomes for this tournament. I didn't specifically handpick guys to be in this tournament in the first place, let alone handpick a winner. But at least on the Raw side of things, there's a bit of progression with it. You do have Jericho beating Kofi. Kofi doesn't really belong there, but Taker and Kane was an interesting first round match. Then you get Taker versus Jericho, which was another cool match. Bray Wyatt and The Miz had a bit of history going back to their the match at SummerSlam between Miz and Cesaro, so Wyatt going over there, there's at least a bit of intrigue in that matchup. Seth Rollins versus Cesaro is more just kind of an exhibition match, but Seth Rollins had been in the main event of SummerSlam, along with The Shield. Cesaro was starting to get showcased a bit more, and he ultimately goes over Seth Rollins here, which was a brilliant move on my part because it does give a bit more credibility to Cesaro. And when I slowly wanted to move him up the card, this was a good chance for him to get some exposure. He goes on to face Bray Wyatt, which I will admit that part of the tournament I was really trying to force in there just because Wyatt got involved in the match at SummerSlam, so I wanted some sort of a payoff between Cesaro and Bray Wyatt. So this would ultimately end their feud, and it was Cesaro going over Bray Wyatt in the end, which, I mean, that's not exactly the best call, but I would ultimately just forget that Bray Wyatt ever existed for a while because I knew the storyline was bad. But more importantly, this gave Cesaro a chance to face The Undertaker in the semifinals, and that was a great matchup, at least at the time. Looking back on it, it doesn't measure up to the stuff that I've produced nowadays, as none of the matches I produced back then really do still measure up. But Cesaro was able to put up a good fight against The Undertaker. It was a good match between the two, and it strengthened Cesaro's credibility because he put up a fight against The Undertaker. Undertaker would win the match in the end, which was the right call because Cesaro was still an up-and-comer, whereas The Undertaker, his spot had already been cemented. If Cesaro had gone over here and gone on to face Mark Henry and lost, it would kind of, I feel it would kind of undercut it, because if you get a big rub by going over The Undertaker, I feel as though that should give you the momentum to go the distance. And really, putting The Undertaker in the final of the King of the Ring tournament gave it more credibility, because if you look at the opponent Cesaro could have faced had he won that match. It ultimately came down to either Wade Barrett or Mark Henry, and I actually think that Wade Barrett versus Cesaro would be a pretty hard-hitting match. I think it would be entertaining. And even though Wade Barrett was in the World Heavyweight title picture around this time, I don't quite think that Barrett-Cesaro would have had the same impact, the same weight, as Mark Henry versus The Undertaker did, especially when you really look at that side of the bracket. Barrett beat Cody Rhodes and Fandango to get here. Mark Henry beat HBK and Triple H to get there. So if Barrett had gone over Mark Henry, again, I feel as though that would have kind of undercut the matches that Henry had beforehand. So it was another good decision to give Henry the edge over Wade Barrett. And then, of course, giving Henry the win over The Undertaker, I do think made sense. I know what I was kind of shooting for there, because The Undertaker would ultimately get a shot at the WWE title anyway. He's The Undertaker. He doesn't need to win a King of the Ring tournament. Whereas with Mark Henry, yeah, he had gotten shots at the world title in the past. Well, a shot, to be specific. But giving him the King of the Ring tournament giving him the win in the King of the Ring tournament really cemented him as a main event superstar. He would ultimately use this momentum to win the world title from Sheamus, and that helped to bring the World Heavyweight Championship to a decent spot on the card, whereas with Sheamus, the booking was left and right all over the place. There was no consistency with it. Mark Henry at least gave it some consistency. It gave it some staying power that somebody could actually hold the world title, have a credible reign, and not drop it back and forth like a hot potato. This tournament definitely falls flat compared to the tournaments I've done since then, but at the very least, it outperforms the quest to dethrone Sheamus, and really, that's all I can ask for at this point. So we already talked about the Intercontinental title match that took place on the pre-show. Now we can move into the actual card itself. And once again, we kick things off with a Jack Swagger match. It's the rematch for the tag team titles, Tons of Funk versus Swagger and Ryder. And Tons of Funk retain the titles here. That's really all this matchup, that's all that happened. The Divas title was defended in a non-brand exclusive matchup as Natalya took on Caitlyn and AJ Lee. The reason why I consider this non-brand exclusive is that AJ was on Raw, but then she kind of just suddenly flipped to SmackDown at one point, so I'm not entirely sure if that had happened yet or not. But either way, like, the Divas title really isn't brand exclusive to begin with. I don't know, I don't even know how AJ ended up going over to SmackDown. It was just one of those things that I guess the rosters changed, and I figured, well, we'll just have this happen. There wasn't really a trade or anything. She just kind of moved. So I guess I can give this credit to SmackDown because all three were SmackDown superstars. Caitlyn would finally capture the Divas title here, ending Natalya's reign, which, looking back on it, it would have made more sense for Natalya to just keep the title here. Of course, I had no idea that Caitlyn would be removed by the time the next year's game rolled around, but she had already lost the match at SummerSlam, and, I mean, like, I guess AJ could have had it here, but at this point, what the division needed was for Natalya to keep the title, and for me to start building up other challengers in the background. But instead, I figured, well, I'll give the title to Caitlyn, so that way we have two relevant women, because Caitlyn's the new champion and Natalya's a former champion, so we can continue doing that there. That's just kind of what happened. It was simulated, so there was no real plan for this matchup. Looking back, I think it would have just been better to have Natalya retain here, get a new face in the title picture, maybe like a Summer Rae or an Oksana. They weren't really built up at the time, but really just throw somebody different in there. But I didn't really have anyone in mind to throw in there, so instead, Caitlyn ended up winning, and I just ran with it. This did start the trend of AJ Lee. Well, actually, this technically didn't start the trend. It continued the trend of AJ Lee losing in Divas title triple threat matches. Because if you remember, back at Over the Limit in 13, she competed against Beth Phoenix and Karma in a match that she lost. AJ would show up in another triple threat match for the Divas title in WWE 2K14. Really, it just started the kind of background underlying storyline of AJ failing to capture the Divas title, how she was never able to capture the gold that she wanted, and ultimately it just kind of represented AJ Lee's lackluster presence in the series as a whole. I was a big fan of AJ Lee. I thought she had a lot of potential in this series, but I just didn't capitalize on it. Especially when you consider that AJ was one of the originals on the roster, back with the likes of Beth Phoenix and Karma, the Bella Twins. But unlike the Bella Twins, like, she didn't disappear. She was there from 13 to 2K15, and during that time span, I could have done more with her, and I just didn't. So by the time she actually left WWE, her departure didn't really impact the series like it should have. Then you get the World Heavyweight Championship rematch between Randy Orton and Sheamus. Sheamus takes it back, and it completely devalues the SummerSlam matchup because Orton's title reign was practically non-existent. It's even worse because Sheamus goes on to lose it at the next pay-per-view to Mark Henry, which devalues this title reign as well. Sheamus is a 3-time World Heavyweight Champion, and none of his reigns really meant anything. And finally, the main event, the WWE title on the line, Dean Ambrose versus John Cena, and I actually have to give this match credit because I took the belt off of Dean Ambrose. Ambrose never should have had the belt in the first place, and I guess I could have tried to run with it, but at the time, that wouldn't have worked well. It's not exactly like I had creative control over the finish to this matchup. It was another AI simulated match. Cena just happened to win it. And I'm glad that I rolled with that, because while it did kind of lead to what, looking back on it now, was a lackluster storyline between John Cena, The Undertaker, and The Shield, it got the belt off of Ambrose. It allowed me to focus on The Shield as a unit rather than trying to push any one guy to the forefront. And in that sense, I was able to tear down The Shield and build them back up to actually be something credible, something threatening. And that laid the groundwork for what would eventually lead to their own singles careers, rather than trying to focus on their singles careers right off the bat, when that completely misses the point of bringing in the Shield as a group, is that these guys they're not established yet, so establish them as a group, so that way they will have credibility when they do eventually branch off in their own singles paths. Because the King of the Ring took up so much time in this pay-per-view, there weren't really a whole lot of non-King of the Ring matches, and in that sense, I do think that it helps to trim the fat of this pay-per-view, because you really only have the essentials. Again, the US title isn't defended, which is a bummer, but you've got the tag titles, the WWE title, the IC title, and the World Heavyweight title, and the Divas title as well. But there aren't really any filler matches in there, because the King of the Ring tournament took up the rest. And while in that sense there is a lot going on with this pay-per-view, honestly, I think it's even worse than SummerSlam. I honestly would have to say that it's worse than Vengeance, just because these matches don't really have a long-lasting impact. Randy Orton's match with Sheamus was completely pointless, and it devalued the matchup that took place before it at SummerSlam, and the matchup that takes place at No Way Out ultimately devalues this match. Ryback's rematch with Christian for the IC title was just, the champion needs a rematch, so he gets his rematch. The Divas title match does get a new champion, but it's an uninspired title change, and it really just continues to fuel a lackluster rivalry. John Cena winning the WWE title was a good thing in that it undid the travesty that was Dean Ambrose as WWE champion. And this does lay the groundwork for the future rivalry, as The Undertaker appears after the match to not really attack John Cena, just kind of spook him. And it sets up the matchup that they're going to have at No Way Out for the title. So while there was a bit of foresight with this pay-per-view, it doesn't really do a whole lot as a standalone show. You get tons of funk in what might be one of the most boring tag team title matchups I've ever showcased on a pay-per-view, defeating Ryder and Swagger in another Champions Get a Rematch match. You'd think that the King of the Ring tournament would help to boost this pay-per-view, because there is at least something going on in that tournament, but a lot of the matches in that tournament were forgettable. It's not until you get to the final rounds that things really start to heat up. So I'm actually going to have to put Night of Champions below Vengeance. I do think that Night of Champions is better than Extreme Rules, but it really isn't that great of a show. There's just a lot of nothing in this pay-per-view, and while it does continue the trend of setting up potential plot points for later on in the series, there just isn't enough meat with this pay-per-view. There's not enough substance to it. And it gets devalued even more when you look at how much better the King of the Ring tournament could potentially have been. You have guys like Daniel Bryan and CM Punk who would have elevated this tournament missing out just because they lost their matches. The whole situation with Bray Wyatt and Cesaro was really backwards, because Bray Wyatt had lost a match to potentially qualify and Luke Harper had won, so they just kind of switched spots because Wyatt was supposed to be in the tournament. And Cesaro had missed his shot because he had a match against Luke Harper, and I believe it was Bray Wyatt who had a match against Rob Van Dam. So Van Dam ended up winning, but I took him out for Cesaro because I wanted to focus on Cesaro. I really wanted to have that Wyatt-Cesaro match. But if guys who qualify can just give their spots to other people, what is even the point of having qualifying matches in the first place? In that regard, it at least did set up the tag team of Swiss Thunder, which I would run with for a couple of games. So it wasn't a total failure of a storyline, but it was just not good. Wyatt should have just won his match, and Cesaro should have just won his, but I didn't control everything back then, so I just rolled with the punches and figured out a way to retcon everything to my own fancy. So yeah, Night of Champions falls just below Vengeance, but it has enough going on that it can at least surpass Extreme Rules. As for which brand has the edge for Night of Champions, I'm gonna have to give it to Raw, just because the King of the Ring tournament, the brackets were better there. All of the matches on this pay-per-view were very underwhelming, but at least the King of the Ring tournament can give Raw a bit of an edge over SmackDown. Then we move on to No Way Out, which again continued the pre-show trend, only unlike with Night of Champions, it's not really necessary here. you have this bizarre mixed tag team matchup with AJ Lee and Cesaro taking on Oksana and Seth Rollins. I guess this was playing off of their first round match in the King of the Ring tournament, and this was supposed to be my way to develop other women on the roster, because I was trying to push Oksana. At one point, I had her aligned with the Shield, and I think that Oksana could have potentially been a Divas champion had she not been pulled from the roster in 2K15. But I shoehorned in this romance storyline between Oksana and Seth Rollins. This wasn't good. Why did this match have to happen? It was Oksana and Seth Rollins who won the match, but it didn't really do anything. At SummerSlam, I said that I was trying to focus on building the Shield back up as a group, but then I'm already going against that, because you've got Dean Ambrose, who has disappeared after The Undertaker set him on fire, and Ambrose would show up later on in the WWE title match to continue his own singles stuff. You had Seth Rollins here against Cesaro. Roman Reigns was in the US title match, so it baffles me that I started to build up the Shield as a group, and then I immediately went against that here at No Way Out. And I would go back to, I would group the Shield back up again and finally stick with that, knowing that the Shield as a group is better than the Shield as individuals yet, because I haven't established them yet. So we did eventually get to the right place, but No Way Out really is not a good night for the Shield. Tons of Funk and the Wyatt family main evented the pre-show with the tag team titles on the line, and because the Wyatt family were representing SmackDown, Tons of Funk representing Raw, this matchup non-brand exclusive, so nobody gets the edge for it. Really, the only thing this matchup was good for was getting the belts off of Tons of Funk and putting them on the Wyatt family. Because moving forward, the Wyatt family would hang on to those tag titles for quite some time. Like I said earlier, they would ultimately tie Ryback's Intercontinental Championship reign for the longest in the series. So all this match was really good for was just setting up the Wyatt family. The matchup itself wasn't memorable, but it did kind of set up a mini arc for Tons of Funk later on, which ties into the matchup at the Survivor Series that the Wyatt family competes in, but I'll save that for when I get to Survivor Series. The US title match opens the show, Jack Swagger defending against The Miz, Kofi Kingston, and Roman Reigns. We all know that Roman Reigns wins this matchup, and he has one of the worst United States Championship reigns in history. There was no reason for him to win. Swagger should have just retained it here, but because it was simulated, I just rolled with it, and I figured, well, we could give Reigns a singles push. And then I immediately went against that going into Survivor Series, so I just had to get the title off of him. This matchup was bad. Really bad. Then there's an exhibition match representing Raw at CM Punk taking on a mystery opponent who turned out to be Alberto Del Rio, who was recently brought over from SmackDown. So this was when Del Rio became officially a Raw superstar. But he ends up losing to CM Punk here, which it just goes to show that I never really cared for Alberto Del Rio in this series. The whole point was to give CM Punk a win. He's trying to get back on the right track. But by doing that, I just completely buried Alberto Del Rio. It's not like I was really doing anything with him on SmackDown. But a win over CM Punk here could have potentially given him something to do. It just didn't. On the plus side, this would eventually foreshadow the Viva Perfecto tag team between Del Rio and Curtis Axel. And that tag team, that alliance, was a bit of fun, so I can at least give it credit for that. Bringing Del Rio to Raw was a good decision. He was doing nothing on SmackDown. Speaking of SmackDown, you had the Divas title match between Kaitlyn and Natalya, this time inside the Hell in the Cell. I've covered this and pretend it never happened. It was terrible. Kaitlyn retained. I don't want this match to exist. Then we flip back to Raw as Daniel Bryan takes on Chris Jericho. This was when Daniel Bryan's quest to get a match with CM Punk finally started to take shape. This was when the main crux of the rivalry began. And at the time, the match wasn't bad. It wasn't a filler match to say, but it was a good kickstart to this Daniel Bryan storyline. He got a big win over a credible opponent in Chris Jericho, and this eventually started to set the groundwork for Daniel Bryan's future encounters with Brock Lesnar. So there is foresight with this matchup, and I do have to say it was a pretty good one. I have stated before that the Daniel Bryan-CM Punk rivalry was perhaps dragged out a bit longer than it needed to, but that was more so the later stages of it. As far as this went, just kind of starting to really kick that storyline into overdrive, I think this matchup served a good purpose. I think it was a good match. It was perhaps even a highlight of this pay-per-view. Then Ryback defended his Intercontinental Championship against Randy Orton, who had dropped down out of the world title picture since Mark Henry was going to be since Mark Henry had earned the shot. So I finally figured out that the guys don't always have to have a rematch just because they were the former champion. You can do something else with that. So Mark Henry winning the King of the Ring tournament was my way of overwriting Orton's rematch clause. Instead, I bumped him down into the mid-card, so to speak. I dropped him down to the Intercontinental Championship picture. But really, what this was supposed to do was elevate Ryback more into the main event status, because before this point, he had gone through guys like Curtis Axel and Christian, who really had never made it into the main event scene. Instead of bringing a world champion down to Ryback's level, this was more so a way to elevate Ryback up to a world champion's level. And I do think this matchup also did a good job at setting up future storylines and adding further depth to Ryback's character. These two had a decent rivalry for the rest of WWE 2K14, and I'd definitely say this would be another highlight of the card. SmackDown's actually doing something right for once. Then you had the World Heavyweight Championship matchup between Sheamus and Mark Henry. Henry defeats Sheamus here. Again, I think this is doing something right because I knew that Sheamus's world title reigns were garbage, and I just wanted a hard reset on the world title picture. So putting the belt on Henry was a good move, and it ultimately worked out for the best. I was happy with how it turned out. So this is another plus for No Way Out. Then you had the WWE title match, Hell in the Cell, John Cena versus The Undertaker. And though I have gone on record bashing this storyline because it really is a convoluted one, it really goes against the whole point of what the Shield stands for. But at the time, this was groundbreaking for the series. This was a storyline unlike anything I had ever attempted before. The Undertaker ends up defeating John Cena, claiming the WWE title, and joining the Shield. Even though it only really existed for shock value, I have to admit that the shock factor of The Undertaker joining the Shield, it still is pretty strong. Even if the whole storyline fell flat, this moment at the very least can stand out as one of those oh my god moments. I guess that would explain why The Undertaker joining the Shield won the OMG Moment of the Year Slammy Award. I do think it was a good main event because even though the storyline as a whole fell flat, it was a good shocking moment at the end of a pay-per-view to really get the audience invested, like holy crap, what's gonna happen next? So when it comes to No Way Out, I actually am gonna say that it's better than SummerSlam. SummerSlam did begin setting up some storylines, and there were some high-profile matchups on there, but the majority of the show falls flat. Not having the WWE title on the card and instead having that six-man tag was rather underwhelming. With No Way Out, there are some pretty terrible, terrible moments, but there are also some not half-bad moments. You've got Bryan versus Jericho. You've got Ryback versus Randy Orton. You have Mark Henry winning the world title. And you even have the shock value of The Undertaker versus John Cena. In the grand scheme of things, this pay-per-view is gonna definitely fall on the lower end of the list, but based on what we've seen thus far, I can honestly say that this was the best pay-per-view I had produced at the time. Unfortunately for No Way Out, it's not gonna hold that top spot for very long, because Survivor Series would come in and immediately overthrow it. And I have to ruin my perfect segue because I forgot to record the Raw vs. SmackDown part. So when it comes down to brand supremacy, it's a really tough call because Raw and SmackDown both had some pretty decent matches on this show. But ultimately, I'm gonna have to give it to Monday Night Raw, if for nothing else than just the pure shock value of it. At the time, the stuff that I was doing with The Undertaker, John Cena, and The Shield was unprecedented. What I was doing with Mark Henry, the world title picture, with Ryback and Randy Orton, that's a lot more textbook. When Mark Henry won the King of the Ring tournament, you could basically see a mile away, given my track record with Sheamus, that Mark Henry was gonna win the world title. With the WWE title picture, I hadn't really gone for that level of a plot twist ever. So while it may not have actually worked out in the end, I feel that I at least need to give it some credit for ambition, because that was it was a type of storyline that I hadn't really attempted before. It was a good way to experiment with something different, and that is just not something that SmackDown was doing at the time. SmackDown was going more by the book. Everything was much more choreographed. I mean, you have Ryback and Randy Orton's matchup, which, I mean, theoretically, when you have a former world champion, they're going to step down the card, so putting them in the Intercontinental title picture makes sense. Whereas having someone like The Undertaker just join up with a new up-and-coming faction to try to... I mean, on paper, it was a good idea. I could see... I mean, I've said before that I could see potential in this angle if I had spun it differently. But, yeah, I just have to give it to Raw here. SmackDown just It doesn't measure up. There's not enough going on there. Unlike with No Way Out, I think that Survivor Series actually delivered on an entertaining pre-show, although I don't think it was as necessary as the pre-show was for Night of Champions. There was an elimination tag team match that featured Natalya and Lita taking on Summer Rae and Oksana, and this was a good chance for the old guard to put over the new up-and-coming talent. Unfortunately, Oksana would end up leaving the series shortly after this, so that didn't exactly work out. Summer Rae had potential. This would eventually lead her to joining the Divas title picture, to winning the Divas title, and Summer Rae had potential. I could have actually booked her strongly, but then WWE 2K14 completely killed the Divas division. I completely killed the Divas division. Summer Rae had so much potential, and I squandered it. Oksana's exit from the series should have put the full focus on Summer Rae, and it did, but it also didn't, because I wasn't really focused on the Divas division quite like I should have been. But as far as this matchup goes, for what it could have implied, I have to say that it was well done. Lita's role in the division, it worked, I think, at this point, because it added a bit more credibility to the division. Lita didn't just show up for a one-off appearance, she was around for a decent amount of time. And because she teamed with a former Divas champion here, and they ultimately went down in what was basically my version of a Divas traditional Survivor Series tag team match, that only elevated Summer Rae and Oksana that much more. That would have been the perfect time to elevate them into the Divas title picture. Somehow Lita ended up getting the next shot at TLC, which didn't really make much sense. I don't know. I guess I didn't have enough confidence in Summer Rae or Oksana. I mean, like, I knew that Oksana was leaving the game, so I definitely wasn't going to give her a shot. But I could have taken the ball and ran with it with Summer Rae. I really don't know why I didn't. And then you had Daniel Bryan versus Curtis Axel to main event the pre-show. The stipulation was that if Daniel Bryan defeated Curtis Axel, he would get a shot at Brock Lesnar in the future. So, of course, Daniel Bryan did defeat Axel. This was back when Curtis Axel was still a Paul Heyman guy, so that was really his inclusion to the storyline. It was supposed to be a way for me to elevate Curtis Axel, just like the Paul Heyman guy storyline was supposed to elevate him in the real WWE. But much like the real product, I failed to capitalize it. It ultimately worked against Curtis Axel, because while he did get a higher profile spot than what he was originally getting, he was just a jobber to the bigger stars, so yeah. Then you had Batista returning, and also kind of becoming a Paul Heyman guy. I've talked about Batista's history in Universe Mode. None of it is any good, except for, I will at least say that the stuff I did with him in 2K16 and 17 was better than what came before it. But at least by that point, I had some self-awareness that Batista was not going to be a main eventer. He was not going to be in the title picture. Unlike here, where I thought maybe it could have happened, but we'll save the rest of that for when I get to TLC. Then we start the pay-per-view with, of course, Jack Swagger and the United States title. Swagger had won it back from Roman Reigns on Mega Main Event, but since that was only a couple of days before this show, I decided, well, let's just throw together a battle royal, throw in 5 people who I believe deserve a shot. That works against this match in that there was no storyline going into it, but because there weren't really any stakes with this matchup, it had more room to impress, I feel, because you didn't really have any expectations going into it. And again, because it's a pinfall elimination battle royal, I think that adds more drama to it, because you slowly see these guys getting knocked down one by one. Whereas with an over-the-top battle royal, you can just kind of get dumped out, and it's not as exciting in my opinion, because you can get thrown out at any time, and then you're done. And I don't think there's as much excitement with that. That's definitely not in a 6-man battle royal. Like, at least, if you're going to have an over-the-top sort of stipulation, you got to be able to have more people in the ring than just 6. Like, I know 2K18 is going to up it to 8, but even then I still feel it's a bit underwhelming. I like the pinfall elimination aspect of it. Give me that option back. But we're not going to turn this into a rant on WWE games. Instead, let's turn it into a rant on my own product. Well, we'll save that for later, because this matchup I actually like. Cesaro was the first one eliminated, which, duh. Then I think it was RVD who was eliminated. Zack Ryder left next, which brought it down to Swagger, Big E, and Alberto Del Rio. You had Big E and Del Rio eliminate Swagger, which in a way laid the groundwork for the future of the US title division, because Del Rio would ultimately defeat Big E and win the US title here, but then he would lose it back to Swagger at TLC, which would set up the triple threat at the Royal Rumble between Big E, Del Rio, and Swagger. So I will give this match credit in that it did set up the future of the US title division. Even though the match itself had no real build to it, the lasting impact of this battle royal was ultimately its biggest achievement. And as far as a pinfall elimination battle royal goes, this was entertaining in its own right, so I can't really say too much against it. It's not until the next pay-per-view that I really start to develop some problems with this Swagger Del Rio storyline. Then we have a tag title match between the Wyatt family and the Primetime Players, a match that never actually happens, because the Primetime Players were attacked by Tons of Funk, who at this point get rebranded to the Main Event Players. And looking back on it, I'm kind of disappointed that Tons of Funk weren't in WWE 2K14, because I would have liked to see how this Main Event Players angle worked out in the long term. The idea for Tons of Funk as two dancing giant baby faces just didn't really work. But the Main Event Players actually had some sort of intimidation behind them because they were heels, they were more monstrous guys. This was obviously a play off of Brodus Clay's I'm a Main Event Player gimmick from, was that in NXT? Was that when he started doing that? Regardless, it did set up a storyline for the next pay-per-view between the Primetime Players and Tons of Funk. And it did just kind of give the Wyatt family a chance to sit on the sidelines, which I guess isn't exactly what you're supposed to do with your tag team champions, but in a way it's better than booking them in pointless garbage matches like what Tons of Funk and Swagger and Ryder had been involved in. So while this was technically a SmackDown exclusive matchup, Tons of Funk getting involved was the more memorable part of it because the match never actually happened, so that's not exactly a point to any specific brand. Then you had the Divas title match between Caitlyn and AJ Lee, which was forgettable. AJ Lee lost to Caitlyn, but it was good in that I was finally getting away from the Natalya-Caitlyn storyline. But this matchup didn't really have any long-lasting implications for anybody. Then we get into the first of two Survivor Series tag team matchups, this one being Team Ryback versus Team Orton. You had Ryback, Cody Rhodes, and Christian taking on Randy Orton, Wade Barrett, and The Big Show. And I like this match in that it gave the spotlight to some lesser utilized guys. You had I guess you could call it a face turn for Cody Rhodes. I don't exactly remember if it had started here or if it had started to take place earlier on. But you get an alliance between Cody Rhodes and Christian, who in WWE 13 had a pretty decent storyline going on over the Intercontinental Championship. So not only do you get that alliance, but you also get the combination of Christian and Ryback, who had also feuded over the Intercontinental title. I really like this team. It's kind of just a mishmash, just throwing guys in there, but they are all connected through the Intercontinental Championship, and I like that. I like that connection. Team Orton doesn't quite have that. You just kind of have guys who aren't really doing anything. Wade Barrett was in the world title picture at one point, so I guess putting him in there was supposed to give... In a way, this matchup was more meant to elevate Cody Rhodes and Christian, perhaps try to get them into... Well, for Cody Rhodes, it was trying to kind of get him back into the Intercontinental title picture. But because you've got guys like Randy Orton and now Ryback who are starting to become more so main eventers, and then bringing in Wade Barrett, this was in a way trying to boost all of the guys involved. And then Big Show's just kind of there. The other four don't really matter in this matchup because it all comes down to the team captains, and it's Randy Orton who gets the win over Ryback. This sets up the final showdown at TLC for the Intercontinental title. So, again, I like this match. It's got scale to it. It builds on the pre-existing storyline while also building to something bigger. And it's a good way to give different superstars opportunities. Give guys like Cody Rhodes and Christian, guys like Wade Barrett and Big Show another shot in the spotlight. Good work, SmackDown. I'm proud of you. Then we have the World Heavyweight Championship triple threat between Mark Henry, Sheamus, and Chris Jericho. Because Del Rio was sent over to Monday Night Raw, Chris Jericho was brought over to SmackDown, and it was a good trade, I feel. Del Rio was doing nothing on SmackDown, and Chris Jericho was slowly moving down the card on Raw, and after having his match with Daniel Bryan at No Way Out, he moves over to SmackDown, gets a win over Christian in his debut, and that elevates him into the world title picture, which is a spot on the card that Chris Jericho hadn't had for quite some time. The last time he competed in the main event for a world title was back at Extreme Rules against CM Punk. So it was a return to form for Chris Jericho, and I like that aspect of it. Sheamus is involved in there just because he gets his rematch clause, but throwing Jericho in there actually spices things up a bit. Ultimately, Mark Henry gets the win in this matchup because Chris Jericho just kind of stood there and watched Sheamus get pinned. So the finish of the matchup might not have been that great, but the right person won in the end. Even though I wanted to elevate Jericho into the main event, it was way too soon to put the belt on him. He would kind of drop back down the card after this and fade away into obscurity for a bit. So getting him into the main event didn't exactly work out as a long-term move, but as far as the title picture itself goes, Mark Henry getting the win here was the right call. Then you have the WWE title match between The Undertaker and John Cena. This matchup is a miss. Cena wins it back, and yeah. And finally, the main event. One of perhaps the most iconic matches in the series, because it's Team Icons, Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and The Rock taking on The Shield. Of course The Shield wins this matchup. There'd be no reason for the Legends to beat the New Guard. But I like this match in that it had more scale to it than the Team Ryback, Team Orton matchup. But what I don't like about it is that it was just bring back Legends. I thought it was a good move to boost the credibility of The Shield because they went through 3 of WWE's biggest stars, and that was the appeal of this match, was that if I want to give The Shield main event credibility, let's put them over 3 of WWE's most recognizable superstars. But I dislike it in that it is just bringing back Legends. It's not actually focusing on superstars on the roster. Team Ryback versus Team Orton does that aspect better, where it is grounded in the current day with the superstars, like superstars who can actually benefit from being showcased in a high-profile matchup like this. Steve Austin and Hulk Hogan just disappear after this. The Rock sticks around for a bit, but the only real purpose for bringing them back was to give the Shield a victory without hurting anybody else. And at the time, that might not have necessarily been a bad thing, because I wasn't squashing anybody on the current roster. At the same time, however, why would you get invested in Team Icons when you know that they're not going to stick around after this? So even though I would say that the Shield versus Team Icons was one of the more memorable matches in the series, not in terms of like technical quality, but just in terms of what happened, the people who were involved, the overall scale of it, I'm gonna have to give SmackDown the edge with this pay-per-view. Team Ryback versus Team Orton was a really good match. It was able to elevate multiple superstars who were actually on the roster. The World Heavyweight title match was good. Henry keeping the title was a smart decision, and it actually has a bit of impact to it, unlike the WWE title match, which was just a flip-flopping of the title. And don't get me wrong, Monday Night Raw was setting stuff up with this. You had the continuation of the Undertaker-Cena storyline, you had the setup for the Swagger Del Rio storyline, and you had Daniel Bryan moving on to face Batista at TLC and later Brock Lesnar at the Rumble. But as a standalone product, I think SmackDown just slightly outperforms Raw here. And as a whole, Survivor Series is by far the best pay-per-view we've seen yet. It takes the top spot by a country mile. And finally, we have TLC. This also has a pre-show. We get the Tag Team Championship #1 contenders match between the Primetime Players and the Main Event Players. The overall pay-per-view had this weird theme because it is TLC, so we gotta have a tables match, we gotta have a ladders match, we gotta have a chairs match. So this matchup was a tables match, and it would ultimately be the Primetime Players going over the Main Event Players. If the Main Event Players had actually stuck around for 2K15, I think giving them the win here might have been an interesting decision. But because they would disappear after this, it was smart to give the win to the Primetime Players, let the PTP build up to a rematch with the Wyatt family. Only this time they would actually have that match, even though they would lose it. Then you have the aforementioned chairs match between Cody Rhodes and The Big Show. I don't even know if steel chairs were used in this match, but if they were, it was really forgettable. The idea of a chairs match is terrible, because you see steel chairs used all the time. What is the point of having the gimmick be, you can use chairs? Just make it a no DQ match. It's basically the same thing. But this was a #1 contenders match for the Intercontinental title, which I was kind of hoping Cody Rhodes would win, but he ended up losing it to The Big Show, so Big Show would get a shot at Ryback at the Royal Rumble, and I do want to give SmackDown credit here for, again, setting up a future match, laying the groundwork for an upcoming storyline. Cody Rhodes would get a shot at the Intercontinental Championship again down the road, so this is, I guess, just, in a way, continuing to build towards his struggle of trying to reach the Intercontinental title, but ultimately failing. And then the pre-show was concluded with a Divas title match between Kaitlyn and Lita. And Kaitlyn won because, really, this matchup was not good because Kaitlyn and Lita, neither of them were in 2K15. So nobody, this matchup was unpredictable in that it wasn't obvious that somebody was going to lose here because they weren't going to be in the next game. But nothing really came out of this. Instead of Lita, like I said, this should have been Summer Rae getting the title shot, because Summer Rae would win it in the Superstars special anyway, so it would have made sense to just pull the trigger early here. But no, that would make too much sense. Let's just give Lita the shot instead. Great work, past me. Great work. Then the show itself begins with, as usual, the United States Championship match between Alberto Del Rio and Jack Swagger. The tradition continues, it's not over yet. And unfortunately, Swagger wins the title back here. I have discussed this storyline in the past. It's not good. The flip-flopping of the title, it really devalues the title. It devalues the superstars involved. Definitely not one of Raw's best performances of the night. Then you have Daniel Bryan versus Batista, building off of what was set up at the Survivor Series pre-show. Daniel Bryan defeats Batista here, which I think was the right call, but it also wasn't, because what happens here is backwards. Bryan defeats Batista, he goes on to have his match with Brock Lesnar, but Batista loses here and goes on to face John Cena for the WWE title at the Royal Rumble. What? Daniel Bryan could have suffered a loss here and he would have been fine, but I wanted him to look strong going into his match with Brock Lesnar, so I let him get the win. And it ultimately worked against Batista, which, again, not a great showing from Raw. Like, I get what I was going for, and this matchup itself was pretty good as a standalone match, but it's clearly I'm just stalling for time to get to Brock Lesnar, and this was a matchup that realistically probably shouldn't have happened, because giving Batista a win would have taken away from Daniel Bryan, so really neither superstar could have afforded the loss here, but somebody had to lose. I was in a no-win situation with this one. Then you have The Rock versus R-Truth, which... So R-Truth had gotten injured by Zack Ryder. He'd gotten run over by a car back in May, or I guess technically it was June, because it was right after Over the Limit. So R-Truth had been on the shelf for all this time, and I had no idea how I was going to bring him back. But the interesting thing was that he actually was injured in my simulation of 2K14. Basically, I had to simulate from Extreme Rules to SummerSlam to start my universe mode proper. And during that time, R-Truth got injured, so I was unable to use him anyway. So I was just kind of waiting to see if the game would make him return, or if R-Truth never showed up in 2K14, I would have just brought him back in 2K15 maybe. But the game did bring him back. R-Truth made a shocking return, coming to The Rock's aid when the Shield was trying to assault him. But then he turned his back on The Rock, and it was a good moment for shock value, but I mean, having R-Truth as a heel I think was a better move than having him as a face. I mean, he technically was a heel when he first joined up with Zack Ryder when he left, but because Ryder turned his back on him, you'd think that Truth was going to be a face. So coming to The Rock's aid made sense, but then attacking him with I guess it was an okay turn. Nobody really cared about R-Truth at the time, so it didn't really matter. You'd think this would maybe be a chance if I wanted to elevate R-Truth into a good spot on the card, I could do that. But that wasn't the point of this match. The point was to get The Rock a win so I could move him into bigger and better things, potentially the WWE title picture. So that's what happened. The Rock got the win, and again, Monday Night Raw not looking too strong with these matches. Although, to be fair, these matches aren't necessarily bad. It's that I'm really harping on what could have been and how these matches failed in the big picture. On their own, I guess they're not terrible. But then we move into a match that was actually good. The Intercontinental Championship ladder match between Ryback and Randy Orton. Ryback gets the win. This match had enough scale to really be worthy of concluding the feud, and as well, the feud built up well into the stipulation. So even though it's pretty obvious that this match happened because it was the TLC pay-per-view, it at least fit the context of the rivalry, and I can appreciate it for that. It was a good way to conclude the feud. I like it. Then you have The Authority, Triple H, and The Outsiders, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, versus The Shield. This was another one of those six-man tag team matches that served strictly to elevate The Shield, putting them up against guys who could afford the loss because they didn't really have long-lasting impacts in the series. Like, for this matchup, The Outsiders arrived for it, they competed in this match, and then they were gone. Triple H would ultimately come back to go against The Shield, or more specifically Seth Rollins, later on. So this match did plant the seed for that future rivalry. And while it is entertaining in its own right, it's just long-term impact there's not much to speak of here. It elevates The Shield as it's supposed to, but you can't get too invested in it just because they're legends, they're not superstars active on the roster. this is one of those matches that works well as a piece of standalone entertainment. So it is good. I will give Raw credit for this. It might not set much up moving forward, but not every match has to do that. I'd say it was a good way to follow up the Team Icons match. Up next was the World Heavyweight Championship TLC match between Mark Henry and Christian. This TLC match wasn't quite as warranted as the one that will come up next between John Cena and The Undertaker. The feud didn't necessitate it, but it at least has a bit of context in that it's Christian who's challenging Mark Henry, so if you're going to have a TLC match at a TLC pay-per-view, it makes sense that Christian would be the guy to pick this stipulation. Christian had defeated Wade Barrett to get this shot at the title, which is kind of weird because you're coming off of the Survivor Series tag team matchup, which Christian lost, but it works because Barrett and Christian were both involved in that matchup. They had a scuffle, so it did kind of build into the number one contenders match, which in turn built into this world title match. We finally got Sheamus out of the world title picture, which was a breath of fresh air that was desperately needed. Chris Jericho had just lost at Survivor Series, so I guess I don't know, I guess maybe he could have been involved in this matchup, but I think Christian was moving forward the right call. This was supposed to set up a potential triple threat at Royal Rumble between Christian, Henry, and Edge, but Christian and Edge were ultimately pulled from 2K14 for DLC, so their inclusion in the game, they wouldn't be included until later on. So that couldn't happen because I reached the Royal Rumble too soon. But this did set up the rivalry that would eventually go on to WrestleMania, so I will give credit where credit's due. As a standalone match, it was good. That's the thing, with TLC, at the time, they were definitely, like, this pay-per-view, from a match standpoint, I think was one of the best I had produced, if not the best. Bringing in the ladder matches and TLC matches really added some dramatic weight to the matches that the standard singles matches hadn't quite done. And even though it was the AI, and I was getting involved, I was playing as one of the characters going up against the AI, so I did have a bit of control over the outcome of the match. But there was more to it than just a standard singles match, whereas nowadays when I control the singles matches, I can pace them out the way I want to, and I think I'm able to work, when I'm controlling the matches, yeah, they are just standard singles matches, but because I can play to each individual character in a way that the AI doesn't always do. So I can give it some more consistency. When it's the AI, I find it just less interesting whenever the AI has a match, but because these are stipulation matches, the AI has a bit more nuance. There's more that they can do. And I think that only benefited these three big matchups, that being the Intercontinental title match, which in a way was almost main event level because by this point, Randy Orton, he was a former world champion, and the fact that he got the win at Survivor Series only helped to really let him keep that status. But Ryback had been holding his own against Randy Orton, so Ryback was starting to move into the top level of the SmackDown card. That was really the whole point of Ryback's IC title reign, was to boost him up into the World Heavyweight title picture, which he would eventually get to. The thing about these three ladder matches is that while the title did stay with the champion, Ryback retained, Mark Henry retained, and John Cena retained, every match had the correct outcome. Randy Orton could have defeated Ryback here, but that would have gone against the whole point of Ryback feuding with Orton. Orton was supposed to put over Ryback to elevate Ryback as the next big star. Mark Henry was starting to establish himself as a dominant World Heavyweight champion. He had gone through Sheamus and Christian, and we were actually getting some consistency with the world title. It wasn't the garbage reigns that Sheamus had had. So if Christian had won it here, that would have undercut the momentum that Henry had, and I don't think a rematch from a different perspective with Christian as the world champion at the Rumble with Edge and Henry would have worked as well. Especially when you think that Christian and Edge weren't involved at that point, so if Christian had won, the world title either wouldn't have been defended at the Rumble, or I would have had to vacate it. So Henry getting the win here was the best call, and it allowed me to, in a way, put that storyline on hold so that I could pick up with it again at the Elimination Chamber. And then you have the WWE title match between John Cena and The Undertaker. This storyline wasn't the greatest, but at the time it was, in a way, revolutionary. It had a scale, a weight to it that really none of my other storylines of the time had. You had the alliance between The Undertaker and The Shield, which was groundbreaking. Then you had The Shield's betrayal of The Undertaker. They kicked him out. So The Undertaker, his world was crumbling around him. And at the point where Taker up until this point had been a mainstay on the roster, at least, going from SummerSlam, up till now, he was a regular guy on the roster. But if I wanted to build him up for a credible WrestleMania match, he kind of had to disappear for a bit. And because the title had been hot potatoing between Cena and The Undertaker up until this point, if Taker had won it back, that wouldn't have been a conclusion to the feud. It would have just kind of, he took the title back and it just ends there. Whereas with Cena retaining, it does close the book on it because Taker doesn't get another shot. He's used his rematch clause. It's over. It's over. And it at least gave John Cena some momentum because rather than the feud ending in a 50-50 way, Cena does come out on top of The Undertaker, and he's able to move forward as the champion. Unfortunately, his title reign wasn't that impactful. He could have at least held it to WrestleMania, but he didn't do that. But hey, he defeated Taker here. I think it was the best way to conclude that angle, especially when you look back on how the thing had progressed, where The Undertaker starts off against the Shield at SummerSlam. Cena ends up overthrowing Ambrose at Night of Champions. The Undertaker steps up to fight Cena, but he ends up cheating, joining with his former enemies to overpower the common foe that is John Cena. And then the Shield ultimately turning on The Undertaker when he doesn't produce the results they're looking for. The storyline wasn't the most well-crafted, but I do think there is a clear narrative progression in that sense, because it does make sense how things played out. And having The Undertaker ultimately lose here and disappear for a few months, I think that was the best way to conclude it, because with Undertaker, his world is crumbling around him. So when he loses here, it's the final straw, so he needs to take some time away. And this would ultimately be The Undertaker's last match as a full-time member of the roster. And while the feud itself might not have been all that great, when it comes to a match to go out on, the final encounter between John Cena and The Undertaker, it was a really good one. I think if you had to pick like a final match to sort of end that part of your career, I think that would be the right choice. It was much better than their match at Survivor Series. I can at least say that much. And I would also say it was better than their match at No Way Out. That might be a tough call because obviously with the Hell in the Cell, there's a lot of spots you can do, putting people through the cell, through the announce table, maybe even through the top of the cell. But that was more of a spot fest. This matchup at least followed a clear progression where guys are climbing the ladder looking for a title. You get John Cena delivering the attitude adjustment off the top of the ladder to put away The Undertaker. That is how you take down the dead man. That is how you win a match. And it didn't have that fishy finish where Ambrose jumps in and gives Taker the win. In this instance, Cena won it of his own volition. He won it of his own power. And I think that was the best way to finally end this weird up and down storyline. So when it comes to this pay-per-view as a whole, I am gonna have to give it the edge over Survivor Series. That's a bit of a tough call on my part because Survivor Series had the big Survivor Series tag team matchups. It was unprecedented at the time. And while TLC did have a lot of matches that were, in the grand scheme of things, didn't accomplish a whole lot. The Divas title match was a throwaway. The US title match just stagnated that feud. Rock versus R-Truth was kind of a throwaway. Bryan Batista was kind of counterintuitive to what the goal was. But even so, the matches that needed to deliver, delivered. The 3 big ladder TLC matches were great. The Authority versus The Shield was serviceable. And even the pre-show matches between Cody Rhodes and Big Show and the Primetime Players versus the main event players, they were both good matches. They set up future storylines, the Primetime Players getting a rematch with the Wyatt family, Big Show getting a shot at Ryback's Intercontinental title, and plus they were building off of stuff. At Survivor Series, the main event players attacked the Primetime Players and took away their shot at the tag titles. Big Show and Cody Rhodes were both involved in the Team Ryback Team Orton match. So it would make sense that these guys got the opportunities that they did. Survivor Series doesn't quite have that. There are more matches that just kind of exist to exist. Storylines are furthered there, but the matches themselves don't quite reach the highest of highs that TLC does. I think it's a really close call between the two shows, and some of you may prefer Survivor Series to TLC. But me personally, I think I have to give the edge to TLC here. I really like it, even if it does have its fair share of flaws. And I forgot to record the Raw versus SmackDown part. It goes to SmackDown because Monday Night Raw kind of sucked with this show. And that concludes this second part of Raw versus SmackDown. I doubt I'll have the WWE 2K14 episode up for a while. I actually don't think that there's going to be another episode of these until potentially after 2K18 has come out. Because like I said in the last part, I am very quickly going to catch up on this series. Even looking at it now, I only have 2 episodes until 2K17, and 2K17 isn't done yet. Plus, these are really long videos, so I feel like if I tried to load them all onto you at once, it might be a bit overwhelming. I have to give you props, though, if you stuck it out for this whole video. If you do find this interesting, I really appreciate it, because this video series is unscripted, but I don't think this is a video series that I could have scripted out. It would have been a lot of work on my part, and it's not that I can't do that, but if I also want to put out universe mode videos, and some people might not like this aspect of it, but also trying to run a second channel, I just don't think trying to put the amount of effort that I could see this series having, I don't think it really works for me. I prefer this style as well. The thoughts you're getting from me are more genuine, because with a scripted video, I have the opportunity to look over it and really process my thoughts, and I could perhaps filter myself, not be as harsh, not be as potentially giving as much praise as I would otherwise. I wanted to approach this series as more of like a podcast style form of analysis, and I don't know, maybe you like that, maybe you don't. Obviously, if you're still at this point in the video, you do like that. Let me know if you stuck it out to this point. How do you feel about this series? I say this because I have not posted the WWE 13 episode yet at the time of recording this. I actually recorded this the very next day, but the next couple installments are going to be a little while down the road, so be sure to stay tuned for those. Be sure to stay tuned for more universe mode, more behind the universe, any other videos that I'm going to be making in the near or distant future. And until next time, keep on YouTubing.